a lot of my scientific journey and contemplative journey are sort of like this interesting co-arising, you could say, that like I become very curious about something because in a way I encounter it and I'm like, oh my God, I think there's something very strange happening here.
So as I said before, Ruben, so nice to meet you.
You too. Lovely to meet you. Yeah, thank you for having me.
Such a pleasure. I've been very curious about this topic for a long time. It's inspired lots of interesting debates between me and meditative friends. Can be a source of difference, I think, between some Buddhists and people more on the Advaita side. So I'm going to be very interested to hear your take, given that you straddle both if I understand, you're also a meditator, a practitioner, as well as a scientist studying it from the more third person objective view. Is that right?
That's right. That means I'm very confused a lot of the time.
Okay, you get to be confused in two ways.
So,
Perfect. And of course, we have a mutual friend, Shamil, who you wrote a paper with recently, that I think a lot of people were excited by, and it was lovely to hear how much he enjoyed that collaboration. And do you imagine there'll be
yeah,
another phase to that?
I definitely think there'll be another phase. That was, yeah, a real highlight in my career writing that paper, and I'm super proud of it. I'll bring it up briefly in the presentation, but yeah, for those who don't know what we're talking about, it's called the beautiful loop, an active inference theory of consciousness.
Hmm. Brilliant. Um, okay, so maybe we can chat a bit more later, but if you want to, unless there's something you want to say before, you can dive into your presentation, give us some context. Um, and maybe I'll remove my spotlight whilst you're doing that.
Okay, sounds good. I'll share my screen and get started.
Brilliant.
Okay, I trust that looks good for you all.
Yep, looks
Um,
perfect.
Excellent, excellent. So very happy to be here. Thank you for joining. This is a topic that I think is so fascinating. So I have a lot I can say about it, and I'm glad we've got now the time to really unpack what this thing called cessation means. And so this all this work is of course super collaborative. So I can only take a small portion of the credit for what I'm about to present, and I'll mention some names as we go, but especially Professor Helene Slagter, with whom I was doing a postdoc when a lot of this research kicked off at the Vrije University of Amsterdam. I'm now an assistant professor at Southern Cross University. And so the title of the talk is Meditation and the Cessation of Consciousness. So I just want to start by saying that before science, before Buddhism, there is reality. And I want to say this because that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in reality. I'm not interested in other people's sort of scientific opinions. I'm also not interested in Buddhism, which is itself not monolithic. There's many different sort of streams of Buddhism and lineages and various other very powerful contemplative traditions. And all of them have a lot to offer, just like our current scientific paradigm has a lot to offer. But really, I'm interested in trying to get behind them. So, although I draw on both of these, what we're really trying to do here is kind of understand phenomena as they are, and for that, we need to just inquire in the deepest way possible. And of course, science and meditation to me are two very good techniques for inquiring about the nature of reality. So what is cessation? So obviously we have a lot of different cessations of consciousness that we're familiar with, right? So we go under general anesthesia when we have a surgery. Maybe some of us have fainted or been knocked out or something like that. We have a small kind of taste of this in deep sleep as well. And then there's, of course, traumatic brain injuries that can cause us to have a cessation of consciousness. Drugs like ketamine or again propofol, general anesthesia. Some animals go into torpor or hibernation, which is a deep kind of cessation, you could say, that lasts for long periods of times, often in caves, as it turns out also that meditators, historically like to practice these cessations in the context of a cave. I don't know if that's a coincidence or not. But the question of cessations of consciousness during meditation are unique because unlike those other cessations, this is very intentional. It's something that happens through the process of meditation, and it's something that advanced meditators can willfully induce. For most meditators, it happens sort of spontaneously, but for some very advanced meditators, they can make these cessations of consciousness happen on demand. And so one of the first papers written about this was authored by myself and several other people. And the aim here was to just characterize what these states are, give their Buddhist context, describe the phenomenology, and then try to make sense of it scientifically. And then, what could it mean given our current understanding of how the mind and brain works. And we also then describe some experiments that were conducted, and I'll go into those in a lot more detail soon. But basically, cessation is the absence of all experience and consciousness, with no retrospective awareness of anything having taken place during the absence, accompanied by a subsequent profound sense of clarity, openness, vitality, and compassion. And often meditators report these profound after effects of the cessation, where there's this intense sort of clarity and openness and flexibility, as if one has a kind of new lease on life, as if waking up from the longest dream or longest sleep of your life. And I want to distinguish between two kinds of cessation. One is nirodha, and nirodha is we can define as a short gap or cut in the stream of consciousness, often followed by a sense of clarity, openness, and compassion. Nirodha cessations are sometimes associated with an important stage of progress in meditation, such as path or fruition. Not always, though. So when these important stages of progress happen in the Buddhist context, then there's a real the key thing is this transformation, this permanent transformation in how one's mind works and how one perceives themselves and reality. But it's often accompanied by one of these cessations. And the other is Nirodha Samapatti, which is the result of a process where one passes through all these jhanas, these sort of tranquil absorption states, with insight and creates the conditions for Nirodha Samapatti to occur. Sometimes for a pre-specified amount of time, up to as long as 7 days, which is very interesting. It is said that Nirodha Samapatti is only available to the most advanced meditators, known as anagamis or arahants, and has the strongest and most profound sort of after effects. So to provide again like a little bit more of this Buddhist context, because I think it's important, because that's where this is explained in such intense detail. So the fading away, cessation of experience, is emphasized in Buddhist meditation. So in a what I think is a classic book on meditation by a much loved contemporary teacher, Rob Burbea, he says, in a moment when clinging, identification, and grasping at inherent existence are pacified, there is the cessation of perception. The phenomena of the six senses do not appear at all. The Buddha stressed the importance of such cessation many times. The Buddha said, that sphere should be understood where the eye ceases and perception of forms fades away, where the ear ceases and the perception of sounds fades away, where the nose and smell, tongue and taste, body and perception of tactile objects fades away. That sphere should be understood where the mind ceases and perception of mental phenomena fades away. The word understood here, I think, is important and does a lot of work. Through letting go of clinging more and more totally and deeply, the world of experience fades and ceases, and seeing and understanding this is of great significance. And the Buddha again said, I say that the end of the world cannot be known, seen, or reached by traveling. Yet, I also say that without reaching the end of the world, there is no making an end to dukkha, or dissatisfaction. Another quite renowned manual on insight by Maharshi Sayadaw says the following, which I very much like. But in the last phase of meditation, instead of falling upon that continuous occurrence, that stream of consciousness, it passes beyond it and alights upon non-occurrence. That is to say, it reaches as if it alights upon cessation, which is the stilling of the formations or conditioned phenomena. And one more. There is, monks, an unborn, unbecome, unmade, unfabricated. If there were not the unborn, unbecome, unmade, unfabricated, there would not be the case. It would not be the case that emancipation from the born, become, made, fabricated would be discerned. But precisely because there is an unborn, unbecome, unmade, unfabricated, emancipation from the born, become, made, fabricated is discerned. It's quite quite unusual language, I'm sure for many people listening in, but it does get the point across, I think. And so, as contemplative science, that is the study of meditation by neuroscientists, psychologists, and cognitive scientists has developed, we've kind of been moving into this new wave of meditation research with an interest in these advanced states. We've had a lot of research into mindfulness and meditation as attention training or emotion regulation. But there's a growing interest, especially amongst a kind of a small group of us, on advanced states of meditation, because we feel that, that's really where the most epistemic insight can be found is with these advanced states, because they reveal something unusual about the nature of the mind and consciousness that can then inform our understanding of how the mind works. So several studies have been conducted, one by Aviva Berkovich-Hanna, who originally found that fruitions and the cessation associated with fruition led to increasing global long-range gamma activity using EEG. Then came our paper that really went into a lot of depth into Nirodha, and for the first time, Nirodha Samapatti, this particularly advanced form of Nirodha. And then several other studies by myself and especially out of Matthew Sackett's lab over at the Harvard Meditation Research Program, many studies coming out. And so I want to talk to you now about the first study that we did on Nirodha Samapatti with a meditator with a background in both yoga and Theravada Buddhism, and thousands of hours of meditation experience and long retreats and so on. And so in this study, we just had the N of one. And we had two sessions, which were on two separate days that we did these recordings. We had, and on session one, we had three conditions that we repeated. One was the resting state condition, another was a focused attention condition, another is the Nirodha Samapatti, and then we had rest, Nirodha Samapatti, and focused attention again in a slightly different order to try to deal with some order effects there. And then on another day, we had the participant go to sleep for 120 minutes, then have just a resting state for 10 minutes, and then Nirodha Samapatti for another 110 minutes. And so we took many measurements. We really wanted to get as much information as we could about this state, because it's so unusual, and it's rare to find someone who can do this for such a prolonged period of time and can really time it at a precise level. So we took neural activity using high density EEG. We measured heart rate, respiration, blood oxygen saturation, movement, skin conductance, temperature, and other indicators of nervous system activity as well. So he was, plugged in all the possible ways that you can imagine. So research question one, does cessation modulate the brain's tendency to generate predictions about the next moment in time? So the idea here is that since the mind is a kind of prediction machine, it's always predicting its experience into reality, and this requires integrating information over time. Does deconstructing the mind all the way down to cessation lead the system to stop making these habitual predictions that actually give rise to all the contents of our mind? So the way that we measured that in this first session is we presented what's called an oddball paradigm. So this is very commonly used in cognitive neuroscience. And in this task, you basically present one tone consistently, like in this case, we're using vowels and deviant vowels, but I can explain it more simply just by giving sound. So for example, it goes beep, 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 boop, beep, beep, and then it just repeats this sort of pattern. And every time you get that deviant sound, that boop, instead of the beep, the brain sort of sees this as a prediction error, right? So it goes beep, beep, beep. The brain starts to make predictions about the next beep, and then it gets a boop, and then it gets this thing called a mismatch negativity, or which is basically just the prediction error in the brain that we can very reliably measure. And in our experiment, we had 80% standards, 300 per block, and 20% deviance. And so you always need, of course, more standards than deviance in order to get the deviant, the surprise, the neural surprise. And then what you do is basically you have the standards and the deviance, and you take the standards from the deviance and you get the difference wave. And then you can look at this difference wave. So this is from, averaging electrodes. And so then you can look at differences in this difference wave across the conditions to see how this prediction error response is changing as a consequence of this meditation. So here you have in the green the focused attention condition, in the blue the neurotic condition, and in the red the resting state condition. And so this is a highly automatic response, and here we didn't find any difference in the prediction error signal. So the brain is not so doesn't seem to be so turned off that it's not still making predictions. Now, okay, this actually makes sense because even in comatose states and vegetative states, you often do find mismatch negativity signaling. So it's in a way it's reassuring that that his brain is not basically dead in this state. We also did a multivariate pattern analysis, which is basically machine learning, a kind of decoding technique to look at the differences. And here you can see that although the decoder struggled more in the neurotic condition, again, this blue line here, we didn't find a significant difference. Although there is a difference, and you should, it's worth noting that when you have a single participant, you have a limited power to find small effects. So it's these things need to be repeated with more participants. But again, it does suggest that this kind of automatic predictive processing remains intact. So question one, does cessation modulate the brain's tendency to generate predictions about the next moment in time? Low-level basic habits of pattern or prediction error minimization appear to remain largely intact. So there's some interesting observations if we go to now the second session about non-REM sleep and cessation that I now want to mention. So we observed that there were rolling eye movements typical of REM observed in the EOG, which measures eye activity. There was no consistent markers of deeper states of sleep. The EEG did show signs of drowsiness and sleep onset. Basically, what this suggests to us that he wasn't in a very deep state of sleep in this condition. Upon awakening, the participant reported having slept lightly and experiencing dreams, and noted that having awareness during sleep is quite normal for them. So this is also interesting, the fact that there's a sort of lucidity that is maintained even in sleep that could potentially explain some of the lack of some of the deeper sleep qualities. Now, we also had some interesting observations about cessation. Now, the participant reported being able to specify the length of neurotic with high accuracy. So we suggested that they return from neurotic at the 90-minute mark without us prompting them. So we could basically test whether the participant was able to stay in the neurotic and come out of it spontaneously exactly at the time that he intended to come out, right? And so during the 90-minute neurotic meditation, there were almost no observable eye movements or body movements, which is very unusual for such a long period of time. The EEG, respiration, oxygen saturation, and heart rate remained remarkably stable and unchanged throughout the entire 90-minute period. Again, quite remarkable. After 90 minutes, the whole group of us noted an increase in heart rate to approximately 105 BPM, a slight increase in oxygen saturation to 94%, and changes in the EEG and EOG signals compared to the previous 90 minutes. So basically, exactly at 90 minutes, we saw the physiology become to be indicative of some movement, some change in the state of mind, which suggests that perhaps he was able to time this very accurately. The participant then spontaneously opened their eyes at 104 minutes. Now, research question two, does cessation lead to a reduction in spectral power in the EEG? So as we were conducting this study, we found out that Matthew Sackett's lab was also collecting data on cessation around the same time, quite serendipitously. And so we thought it would be interesting to try to see if we can replicate some of the findings. So they had initially found that as one goes into cessation, so here's the pre, there's the cessation, and then post, they found a quite remarkable reduction in power in the alpha band, which is the dominant frequency band in the brain immediately after cessation, or kind of in the transition period of being in cessation and coming out. So we thought, I wonder if we get this also for Nirodha Samapati. So in here we these are the kind of details of how we extracted the different frequency bands. But basically, here's what we found. So we found quite similarly that the alpha band reduced from wakefulness to non-REM sleep to meditation, and especially meditation was significantly different to wakefulness. But you kind of see this kind of gradual reduction in alpha power that was somewhat consistent with the other findings. But with Nirodha Samapati, we also see differences in the theta band and in sigma and beta. So we see a kind of more broad frequency band differences in Nirodha Samapati, suggesting that it might indeed be like a deeper shutting down even than Nirodha, which is a kind of perhaps like a less deep form of cessation. And if we plot the frequency bands right across, all the way from 0.5 hertz to 47 hertz are super fast frequencies, and then Nirodha Samapati is the purple line here, and the orange line is rest, you can see that across many frequency bands, especially theta, alpha, and beta, we see that Nirodha Samapati is lower. So you really have this broadband reduction in power in the brain. And you also see a particular difference in theta between Nirodha Samapati and sleep condition. And again, it's of course important to see that this is different than sleep, that it's something other than just the kind of restful state. And very interestingly, we actually found that in the sleep state, heart rate was higher, sorry, lower than in Nirodha Samapati. And this is interesting because neural activity is lower in Nirodha Samapati, but heartbeat is higher in Nirodha Samapati. So this is an interesting kind of dissociation, which suggests that even though cessation is reducing neural activity, it is sort of a physiologically activated state potentially. So the answer to this is yes, Nirodha Samapati results in a relatively broadband reduction in spectral power compared to waking, except for very slow and fast frequencies, as well as reductions in theta compared to non-REM sleep. Another question we had, and this is the final question that I'll describe in terms of the detailed data, neural data, does cessation lead to a breakdown in cortico-cortical communication? So cortical communication was again measured by Matthew's lab using something called the phase lag index. And basically this measures, if you take, for example, two nodes in the brain and you get kind of activity over time, you can basically test just how synchronous these activation patterns are. Then you can see, in the different states, how synchronous was neural activity. Synchrony is very important so that the brain can kind of make unified models of reality and share information throughout the brain to kind of put all the pieces together to give us this coherent experience of reality. And so this is from the old data, the previous data that we were trying to replicate, where we can see that as you approach cessation, the neural synchronization goes down, kind of peak low synchronization around the cessation event, and then it gradually comes back. So the meditation seems to desynchronize neural activity, leading to this cessation, and then it synchronizes and binds it all back together. We'll come back to this when we talk about theoretical explanations for what's going on with cessation. So as in our data, when we looked at this, we very much found the same thing. So when we compared Nirodha Samapati to the resting state condition, we found that PLI and neural synchrony was lower. We also found that it was lower than a non-REM sleep condition. So basically, neural synchrony in the alpha band was lowest during cessation, followed by sleep, and then rest, very much replicating the other findings, and again, suggesting something going on with this neural desynchronization, and again, reassuring to see that it's different than the sleep condition. So does cessation lead to a breakdown in cortico-cortical communication as measured by phase lag index? Yes, this measure indicates possibly impaired cortico-cortical communication in the alpha band. So we broadly replicate findings from 2 different meditators from 2 different labs comparing Neurota and Neurodisciplinarity, which I think is really important to do, especially when you're using these single subject designs. So this is some new work conducted by Emma Demsar and colleagues on the microphenomenology of cessation. I won't spend a lot of time on this because this could be, again, a whole talk in itself. But microphenomenology is basically this very rigorous interview technique to get at the fine-grained details of experience. So you do these extremely long interviews on these like super short periods of phenomenology, and you repeat it over and over again to try to really understand in like ridiculous details what's going on in your experience, because we skip over so much of our experience in day-to-day life. So in this study, basically, there was 6 90-minute microphenomenology interviews with an advanced meditator. And the meditator in each interview did a cessation meditation within 3 hours before the interview. And then there was a focus on the kind of short periods around cessation, around the entering cessation, and exiting cessation. And these are just sort of seconds, right? And then you have these longer periods in the meditation and the post-cessation. But really, the focus was in these kind of these moments before and after, which is where all the kind of juicy stuff happens with cessation, right? And so these were categorized as follows based on the like super detailed verbal reports. So the entering cessation phase was talked about as awareness in darkness or boundless space, beginning with bare awareness, then this sinking sensation, or this sort of like being sucked into a kind of portal, this kind of increasing honing in of attention, then this cessation moment, which is, of course, there's no sense of time, space, anything having happened, and then this emergence of awareness, this sort of pure awareness moment, then this glimmers of light, and then all-pervasive light, a rush of energy and joy, and then this sense of total release of any kind of grasping. So there's a few things that I think are just a nice quotes around the moment after cessation that speaks to the nature of consciousness, I think, in a really interesting way. So the immediate experience, the first experience, is the awareness. There's a moment in time where you're aware of the awareness. The awareness is there. Before that, there's nothing there. It's just turning on, a switching on. It's not gradual. It's just there, just total, unchanging, fundamental, static awareness. There's just like a knowing there. I mean, that's the word that I'm using, but it's just like there's a perception of darkness. There's an understanding, not even a recognition. Very interesting description, this. It's such a small experience. For a moment, it's perceivable, but it's always there. There's a solidity to it. It's fixed. This is the most basic, fundamental experience, fundamental awareness, because it feels like that it's always been there. That's just the awareness. Everything else that comes after that is just added on top of it. The awareness remains the same as these things come up. Even when I open my eyes and continue on for a few moments after the meditation where everything is hyper clear, that awareness is the same awareness in that beginning moment and all the way up until that point. So I think it's beautiful to hear this from someone who clearly has cessations of awareness, but then they describe how, nevertheless, despite the fact that you can have a cessation in awareness, awareness is important. Awareness is this sense, in some sense, a kind of groundless ground of experience. So I just wanted to say this, is awareness the irreducible ground? And this is, of course, a debate that's like perennial and is like super active, and people are always arguing about this. And I'm sort of an advocate of a kind of middle way, where it is, in a way, irreducible, but it's also groundless. So I said this recently on Twitter or X. Consciousness is both more flimsy, constructed, contextually dependent, and more mysterious, vast, and irreducible than most want to admit. Rarest seems the capacity to hold these facts in tandem, and I'm sure this is something we'll talk about later on. So now to talk about some theoretical explanations, like how the heck is it possible for one to turn themselves off? I mean, it seems like a paradox. How can you from within, in a way, begin to shut down the machinery that gives rise to our conscious experience? It's a fascinating paradox or contradiction that ends up resolving itself when you actually understand the meditation practices, and I think when you understand what might be going on theoretically. So there's two papers I want to talk about. The first is this one published in 2021 that I'm very proud of, and it was the paper kind of core paper I worked on with Helene during our postdoc that kind of laid the groundwork for the experimental work that we've been doing since. It's called From Many to None: Meditation and the Plasticity of the Predictive Mind. I've given hour-long talks on this, but just a brief kind of download. So the predictive mind, this kind of dominant paradigm in cognitive neuroscience, proposes that the brain constructs reality in this hierarchy. So basically, we're constructing every moment of experience, or the brain is constructing it from, well, the body as well, through also action. It's a highly embodied process. All the way from like raw sensations to and from all the kind of sensory streams into more conceptual categories, and then into thoughts and narratives and so on. And so, for example, when you're listening to the sound of my voice, at the most sort of fine-grained early stages of processing, is just pure sound, right? It's pure sound. There's no words. Then there's kind of syllables as you go higher. Then there's kind of words, and then there's sentences. Then at the highest level, you're tracking this whole presentation, and the brain has to do this constantly and track these things over time, and always kind of be in this balance between the present moment and the longer narrative and story of what's happening in one's life. And so we propose in this paper that you can understand a lot about meditation just by thinking of it as deconstructing these layers of the predictive processing hierarchy. And you can categorize this as going from the thinking or narrative self, so our stories about ourself, down through focusing our attention into the present moment sensory stream, into a kind of experiencing self where you're in touch with the sensations in a more raw and direct way. And then you can go deeper and even let go of sensory experience, where you start to have this sort of raw subjectivity experience, kind of just pure awareness kind of experience. And then you can even deconstruct that to have these kinds of cessation experience. So kind of going from narrative self to experiencing self to this kind of pure subjectivity to a cessation moment, and then the reawakening to one's life. So by bringing you ever closer to the present moment, meditation deconstruct abstract processing until all layers of our self fall away. And I think this awareness is a kind of the final graspy self that's there. And again, awareness is this sort of extremely irreducible ground to experience, but it seems to also be malleable, as we know from all these different kinds of states that induce unconsciousness, like propofol general anesthesia and, brain traumas and so on. Now, the other paper that is relevant here is our recent work with Shamil that Amir already mentioned, and Carl Friston recently joined us on this paper as well to formalize it. And it's called A Beautiful Loop: An Active Inference Theory of Consciousness. I really recommend that you read this if you're interested in these topics. And so in this paper, one of the many things we tackle is the issue of the unified and coherent nature of all experience. So all experiences, again, all the way from the narrative even to the awareness, is this sort of unified, coherent experience. It's sort of put together. It's one experience where all the sensory streams, while there is senses or while there is thoughts, are all kind of in a coherent space where they're bound together. This is often associated with the binding problem. Like, how does the brain work out on all of these modular things in different parts of the brain, and then it all somehow comes together into this unified experience. It's really one of the fundamental mysteries of the mind and in all the mind sciences. So we propose something we call Bayesian binding as a potential solution to this. I won't go into all the details, but it is relevant for cessation. So just to give you an example, so when we put together a face is and you can imagine a kind of very noisy situation. The data that comes into our eyes, given our rapid eye movements that are constantly happening, and the actual kind of amount of signal in our senses is actually very noisy. The reason that we get sharp experiences and clear experiences is because we have experience, we have expertise, we have priors, we have beliefs. So for example, we have like a high level abstract representation of a face, one that we would normally draw, for example, if we were generating it ourselves, which is then matched to our sensory input. And it's through this kind of predictive process of top-down, bottom-up dance that we reach this kind of posterior, which is our bound face percept, where the face looks like one holistic object that we kind of understand, recognize, and parse in a very kind of clear and easy way. Now, the same can be true for our whole experience, right? The whole experience is kind of pieced together and bound together in the same sort of way that we bind together smaller things, right? Like we bind together the features of this cup into a single cup, the body into a body, a face into a face, and we kind of make objects that are made up of all these tiny features into a bound object. We do the same with our conscious experience, is what we propose, right? So our whole field of conscious experience is itself like the face, except it's just binding all of the features of our experience together. So we call this Bayesian binding. So as for Nirodha-Samapatti, here's what we propose. Formally, we hypothesize that cessations of awareness occur when the inferential competition of all the senses putting together a coherent model of reality fails to reach a global coherence due to deconstructive meditation, which steadily accumulates evidence against the coherence of the reality model. This Bayesian unbinding of the reality model includes the recursion signal necessary for pure awareness. In Mahayana Buddhist terms, this reveals the groundlessness, substrate independence, or emptiness, sunyata, of all phenomena, including consciousness and emptiness itself. Under the right conditions, such an insight may be associated with significant changes to cognition, perception, and self-experience. So I want to unpack this a little bit more because a lot of that was quite technical. So we can call this the disintegration hypothesis or the Bayesian unbinding theory of cessation. So insight practices, so meditation practices deconstruct, differentiate, and unbind fundamental components of awareness. So often in insight meditation, you pay attention to particular parts of your experience and see their kind of emptiness or their impermanence and so on. In Theravada Buddhist practice, one deconstructs the 5 aggregates of clinging: form, feeling, perception, intentions, consciousness, which is meant to make up the whole field of experience. So you go through each core kind of category of experience and you deconstruct them. And we propose that this deconstruction leads to an inferential failure to bind experience into a coherent, unified whole. So basically, the predictive system through this meditation gathers evidence against the unification of consciousness. And if you gather evidence against the unification of consciousness, then that inference, that predictive inference breaks down and boom, there goes consciousness at the same time. This is evidenced by breakdown in synchrony in neural activity, as I've described before. And this is also the same finding you get with propofol and ketamine. So other drugs that induce unconsciousness, you get the same sort of breakdown in neural synchrony that I described earlier with cessation. And this breakdown in normal synchronization may indicate an impairment in cortical communication and thus failure to share information crucial for binding together a coherent conscious experience. Now, I'm talking about cessation as if it's one thing, but I just want to make a caveat now, and especially for going forward in this space. There's a recent book that came out that we have a chapter in the book. It's called The Varieties of Nothingness, and there every chapter describes this extraordinary literature about nothingness across all the great spiritual traditions of the world. Like, I mean, every single one. We had this incredible meeting in the Blue Mountains a few years ago on this particular topic, which then turned into this book, The Varieties of Nothingness, where we had scholars and practitioners from all these different traditions come and describe nothingness from the context of these traditions. And it was um, just fascinating to see how important this idea of nothingness is and how varied it is. And even within the Buddhist tradition, this idea of nothingness or cessation is varied. And there's all kinds of cessation. You can talk about cessation where everything is gone, or you can talk about cessation or degrees of cessation where there is still some awareness, or you can talk about other kinds of cessations where there's this sort of what some people call as this sort of sparkling, magnificent sort of darkness that's kind of impossible to put into words, and so on. So it's just a rich thing to explore, and we shouldn't get stuck on imagining that it's one thing. Now, I want to say something about the staggering after effects reported by meditators, because again, the goal is not to just go into cessation. It's not about like disappearing from the world and not existing anymore. It's about the transformative effects. In fact, you're not aiming for cessation in the meditation. You're just doing the practice, and the practice leads to cessation if the insight is sufficiently clear. That's the kind of theory. But what's important is the transformation that can happen as a consequence. So I want to propose this idea of a computational reset. So we propose in the original Neurosamapati paper that one possibility is that cessation leads to a kind of inner reset, reducing one's computational trust in priors that encode deep beliefs about oneself in the world, which have been revealed to be highly vulnerable and volatile in light of cessation. So if you deconstruct all your existing beliefs and understanding about reality, and then you have this cessation, suddenly the system awakens to the kind of impermanent and flimsy, let's say, nature of everything, and the fact that there is no permanent self there, right? And you see that it's all kind of constructed in some way. This could foreseeably explain some of the trait effects often touted by meditators following such experiences. For instance, less grasping. So the organism now expects that things are always changing, so does not resist when things do in fact change. So when you go through like a long meditation process, it's basically like a constant process of discovering where you're stuck, discovering what you're attached to, discovering what's the new amazing thing that you think is it, until everything that you think is it is kind of released, right? And consciousness is one of the final things that you're just sure this must be it, right? And you're just grasping at this idea of consciousness in your own mind, and consciousness turns out to be just nothing as well. So basically, to put it really simply, one deconstructs their mind through insight. A cessation may occur, and you may notice it, you may not. But what's important is that the system does not return in the same way. It returns in some sort of new way, in a better way, in a less graspy way, a more flexible way, a hopefully more compassionate way. And this is what allows the system through letting go of this grasping and this insights to have a kind of fresh lease on life. It's like a new stream of consciousness is available. And so just to conclude, for what this all means for me to be researching cessation and thinking about this also as a meditator, to me, cessation teaches us that there is nowhere to stand and nothing to hold on to, not even consciousness. It therefore reveals that there is no place to hide from the totality of our experience. And we can say that when the world, self, and other are seen to be groundless, what is then left but interdependence, this total embeddedness in our lives? And that's all I have to say. And I just want to give one more big thanks to all the people who worked with me on this. And again, a special thanks to Helene, and thank you for listening. I'm happy to take your questions and discuss.
Yeah, brilliant, Ruben. Thank you so much.
No worries. Hey, do you mind if I quickly go and check on the air conditioning?
Yeah, of
I'm
course.
sweating big time. Just give me
Very
just
jealous
one
that
minute.
that's the problem you're having, but great, you go do that.
Very Australian problems. One
Okay,
second.
perfect.
Okay, I'm back, and I realized I nearly went for an hour, but it was good. I could take my time. I like that. I usually have to rush through these things, so thank you for
Oh,
bearing
more like
with me.
formal conferences and
Exactly, exactly. I think the
Amazing.
last time I gave this talk, it was in 15 minutes.
Okay. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
All right. I can't imagine. Yeah, it could easily have gone on longer. It was really fascinating. It's amazing that you're bringing the scientific lens to this. Obviously, a question I'm sure you get asked, I don't know how comfortable you are answering it, is this an experience you personally have or have had?
Yeah, yeah, I have. I probably mentioned a few times in podcasts and things, so I'm
Okay,
already
great.
out of the closet in some sense about this stuff. And to be honest, a lot of my scientific journey and contemplative journey are sort of like this interesting co-arising, you could say, that like I become very curious about something because in a way I encounter it and I'm like, oh my God, I think this thing, there's something very strange happening here. And then I go and research it, right? And in fact, it's the same also from because I did a PhD on insight experiences. And I was fascinated, but because I was having these insights when I started my sort of contemplative journey when I was very, 19. And I was having these insights, but then I got into this sort of meta thing. Okay, like what is an insight? Like what is that? And that's what I ended up doing a PhD on. And then there's this sort of development of like various experiences I have, and I'm like, okay, this I now really want to understand this from a scientific lens as well. So there's a kind of dance between these two things, and I try not to be too sticky in either my experience or the science, and hold both of these things lightly. And again, try to get underneath both to something more fundamental. Yeah.
I can easily imagine how having the experience would help you in doing the science. Obviously, some people would argue that might make you biased, but personally, I can see how, okay, well, you know what you're aiming for. You have a sense of, it'd be like someone trying to study, I don't know, whatever chocolate, never having tasted it. You could do it, but it would bring a different quality of understanding. D Does it work the other way around as well? Do you sometimes find your what you discover through the scientific lens then aids or supports your meditation practice?
Very, very good question. I think definitely yes. The scientific process, I mean, again, for me, it's just the inquiry into truth, and the scientific process is the same, except you're bringing the mind to the work. And in fact, in many meditation traditions, although sometimes you think, okay, the mind is sort of this problematic thing you're trying to get out of the way, that turns out not to be true at all, I think. In fact, the mind is the tool, and it's through the mind that we come to understand things in also in meditation, and perhaps through the heart as well. But the scientific process is very much about refining our understanding through the mind, and this definitely helps with the meditation because it clarifies my sort of world model, and our world model is what drives our predictive processing. That is sort of the kind of inferences that our mind makes, and the more clarity we have in our world model, which is what the science allows us to do in a much more objective way than I think any kind of religious tradition or spiritual tradition. The more clarity we have, the more grounded we are. So I also feel like the scientific process grounds the meditation. Meditation and spirituality can get so fluffy, and people can get so off the ground, whereas the science is breeds this epistemic humility about everything that is so valuable for a meditation practice and any kind of worldview, I think. And so I think it very much these things are. In fact, I think the distinction is ultimately some sort of illusion, but I understand that for purposes of conversation, it's that there's a difference. But
Mm,
again, there's just the inquiry into the nature of reality, really.
mm. Do you have an example of,
Yeah, I
of
mean,
something you, yeah, go on.
yes, I mean, to be honest, the idea that we had in the paper, Many to None, that I did with wrote with Helene, there we had this insight that as you come deeper into the just relaxing into the present moment is all you need to basically deconstruct everything. Because the brain is completely reliant on integrating information over time. It has to put moments together to make sense of reality. And so if you're not putting moments together, um, you're going to disappear. You're going to enter these states. And so this teaches you that, okay, there's nothing to hold on to. You just it truly is what was always said, to just be in the present moment. You can see that from the brain's perspective as this thing that goes completely against all the predictive machinery of the mind, is to be in the present moment. And also this understanding of the four selves is, I think, really interesting, right? The narrative self, the experiencing self, and then you could say the pure awareness self, and then you could say the non-self, the beyond self, right? These sorts of categories help make sense of one's experience because you can tune into them and you can see, okay, I'm aware now of my narrative self and the sort of thoughts that are in my space. Okay, I'm also conscious now of my experiencing self. I'm also conscious that I'm witnessing my experience and my thoughts. And you can kind of use these scientific categories to make sense of your own reality that actually makes the meditation easier. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Brilliant. And as I think I mentioned, we've had a lot of dialogue with Bernardo Kastrup on this channel, and he's mainly approached this question of what is reality through a philosophical lens, drawing, of course, on some introspection, drawing, of course, on science, but he contends that philosophy is different from science. Um, do you agree, and do you also bring a philosophical lens into your inquiry into what is reality?
I um I pay
Or is it okay if I say
my
one thing about the distinction he makes, just to make it more clear?
sure.
He
Yeah,
believes
yeah, please.
that science is the investigation into the patterns of nature. In other words, I look at repeated patterns and then I try and come up with models that then it's kind of like predictive processing, try to predict what will happen next. But it has nothing to say, if I've understood his view, it has nothing to say about the ontology or what is behind the patterns or what the patterns are made of. And it's agnostic in terms of, is it pure consciousness? Is it strings floating around? Is it atoms? Is it something else? Um, and none of that has much bearing on the work of scientists of looking at the patterns and building up models to predict the patterns. So yeah, your comments or perspective on that.
Maybe to a philosopher, this sounds naive or something like that, but I don't know. In both cases, science and philosophy are basically throwing concepts at something that is not conceptual, right? You're casting a net over the ocean and trying to say it's this or it's that. And I think both science and philosophy are just as prone to doing this. But I think in any case, when you think that your concept is an accurate description of reality, I think you've missed the point entirely. And I don't see how philosophy gets you there. I think for me, it's about holding all models lightly and understanding that all maps are just maps and that the territory is something fundamentally mysterious, especially from a limited perspective, like this tiny little brain that we're trying to use to make sense of it. And I don't think you somehow get to some more accurate ontology just by thinking about it deeply and coming up with like very clean concepts. I mean, to call it again, I mean, you can come up with a very clean conceptualization of awareness, but then if you just poke at that concept of awareness enough, I mean, what are you talking about? Right? And the same thing you do with matter. If you go deep enough to matter, you end up just being like, what the heck are you talking about? Both are empty in their true nature, really. And so I don't think there's any kind of solution there to lean so heavily on philosophy as some sort of solution to building a kind of ontology.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and even putting aside whether or not we can ever arrive at a solution or final conclusion, is it a tool that you consider as part of your, is it like a third tool distinct from science for you, or, or does
No,
it
I,
make sense?
I,
Yeah.
I don't think it's a different tool. I think they're very interwoven. I think as long as you're again, if you're in the realm of concepts, for me that's science and philosophy are kind of working together very, but so is something else, right? There's just this. So okay, so if we go through a scientific process, right? Like I'm trying to come up with a new theory or a new hypothesis, a new experiment. It emerges in this sort of mysterious moment of insight in my mind. Okay, so there's something very mysterious happening. Out of nowhere, an insight comes to my mind, and suddenly I want to pursue this thing. Okay, so there's something mysterious that's driving my science already to begin with. And then I'll think about that, you could say philosophically or critically, and I'll try to break it down and make sense of it, clean up the concept and see if I can make sense of it. That you could call the philosophical phase of the journey. Then there's the experimentation phase, which you might call the scientific phase. And then there's again the philosophical and that is sort of the analytical phase of making sense of all the data and so on, or analysis rather. And then there's the philosophical analysis that comes again after that. What's the meaning of this data? And yes, okay, you can pass all of these as kind of separate things, but to me, it's sort of one continuous process, each feeding into each other. And it's sort of find it hard to imagine really doing philosophy without science, doing science without any philosophy, because you have to do theory in order to do science, and you have to do philosophy to do good theory. And I also find it hard to imagine doing pure philosophy without any science. I think, where is your philosophy grounded in that case?
Yeah, that makes sense. The distinctions potentially, it lies in a continuum rather than being binary. It certainly sounds though like you've arrived at the conclusion of awareness being empty or consciousness being empty. Um, s- uh, do you feel like cessation? Or actually, let me bookmark that question because I'm super curious as well. Just personally, did you start from science and then start meditating, or was it that you were meditating and these experiences were happening and that inspired your scientific journey?
Very much in tandem,
Hmm.
very much in tandem. Like I originally went to university to study archaeology. Um,
Oh
I
wow.
ended up in I ended up in geology, and I was fascinated by science already then, but I was more fascinated in just like the ancient world. But then then my interest in so I was already kind of had this scientific attitude, but it was through these experiences that thought started to think, no, no, there's something about consciousness that I need to look at. And I need to sort of change the thing that I'm directing my inquiry towards from things out there to, what's going on in here. And that's when I started to get into neuroscience and psychology in a really deep way. But then the inquiry was always together, right? So because, I really got into meditation when I was about 19. And that's also when I started to study neuroscience and psychology. And then they just were kind of complementing each other all the way through now for, well over a decade.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And just one more personal question, if it's okay, because most very dedicated there's a lot of dedicated meditators who, given how much time it takes to, um, I think you said in one of your papers, cessation tends to be something that might happen on retreat. It takes a lot of preparation, it takes a lot of time. A lot of people I know have dedicated their lives to this probably wouldn't have time to also do a PhD. My friends who are doing a PhD seem to be very stressed around time. That's all they do. There's no time to reply to emails or messages. So I'm curious how you manage to combine both, maybe to inspire anyone else who wants to follow that double path.
I don't know. I'm just maybe just stubbornness, to be honest,
Right.
and like relentless curiosity, right? Like and again, because they were complementary. So if you're, I can understand if you're doing a PhD on some like politics or something like that, and then at the same time you're trying to pursue a deep meditation where they feel like two different realities or something like that. That might be harder. Maybe it was easier for me to pursue them very intensely because they were feeding into each other, and they were really like I kind of understood that the meditation was helping my science and the science was helping. They were just one inquiry into the nature of the mind, and ultimately that's what I do now. I just like write about the nature of the mind and try to do experiments in myself and out in the world. So it's all kind of feeding into each other. But I would say it's just stubbornness and relentless curiosity that allows this this
Great.
kind of thing.
Well,
Yeah,
to be celebrated. It's inspiring. Um, and then yeah, it's this kind of barrage of questions. Okay.
please.
Yeah. So, yeah, coming back to cessation, it sounds like you've drawn the conclusion that awareness or consciousness is empty, or it's certainly not w- how it's presented in some non-dual traditions as the ultimate ground of being. It's also groundless. It can be seen through as a dependent arising, which my understanding is more something that comes up in some Buddhist schools. Is this insight or perspective one that you came about through the experience of cessation, or in a way, I'm asking the same question I asked before, but in a slightly using this as an example. Is it something that can be arrived at philosophically, like you kind of thought this makes sense to me, or is it something that was clear to you once you had these experiences of cessation, and you don't think it would be so clear for someone without that experience, or maybe just
Mhm.
speaking for yourself personally?
Uh, yeah, I think any kind of insight is deeper when it's complemented by direct experience in most cases. In some sense, then it becomes something in your bones as opposed to something that's in your mind as a kind of concept or story, right? Stories are very easy to deconstruct, right? And so I think you can definitely arrive philosophically or scientifically at the idea of the groundlessness of consciousness, because that's kind of the mainstream position in neuroscience, is that consciousness is sort of like an emergent property of the brain or something like that. To me, that's far too simplistic. But they obviously arrive at that conclusion, but it doesn't come with the same quality as having the experience, because the experience is it's not so much the important that what your opinions end up being about consciousness. It's what's important is that you're not grasping at consciousness anymore, and you're not going through life trying to reach some weird state of pure consciousness where you can just be like always in the state of pure consciousness. I mean, that just sounds like a terrible trap. Like, what a way to go through life to feel like you always have to be in one particular kind of state, right?
Yeah.
Or one particular kind of recognition all the time. That's exhausting. I know that also because I've been in that phase myself of trying to always be in pure awareness. And so I also want to say that there's a middle way here, because again, I was trying to point that the awareness is special. It is somehow irreducible. And these pointers, the kind of Advaita pointers towards awareness, are profound meditation tools and exceptionally psychoactive, very, very impressive, especially the kind of transmissions that happen between students and teachers in the context of Advaita Vedanta. The problem is getting just stuck and having you go into this deep state of, say, presence, and then you may even recognize this awareness, and then to getting stuck in this sort of loop of trying to constantly maintain this sort of awareness state. This is just a new kind of samsara, a new kind of suffering that comes at grasping at this idea of awareness. So to me, it's we can at once appreciate the power of these traditions and these pointers towards this raw awareness, which also comes up very, very strongly in Vajrayana and Tibetan Buddhism, in Dzogchen and Mahamudra, also point to the fundamental nature of mind, though they kind of, in a very non-graspy way, though, there's this sort of emptiness of emptiness and the emptiness of awareness built into it, but they still use this pointer, right? So you can have the best of both worlds.
Hmm.
In this, yeah.
Yeah. Um, what I was going to ask you is, do you think, because it's mainly seems to be stressed, again, from my limited knowledge, this experience or the importance of this experience seems to be mainly stressed in Theravada Buddhism. I could be wrong about that, but in the paper you sent me, you do, I don't know if it's a speculation or you're fairly confident about it, that it does arise in other traditions. And one name you mentioned is Ramana Maharshi, who was um, he's more placed in the Advaita tradition, and he would spend many days, I think sometimes being completely unresponsive to stimuli around him. So it does seem reasonable to suspect he was in the same or a similar state. What I've read from him, however, does seem to be sit more in the Advaita camp of, so Advaita, just for anyone who doesn't know that term, is this non-dual camp um, of philosophy or spirituality, which posits awareness or the self with a capital S, or consciousness being primary and that which is behind and continuous through all experience and existence. Do do you do you think that's potentially mine or others' misinterpretations of Ramana Maharshi, or that one could have this experience and come to different conclusions? Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
All right, I have to speculate here, right? Because I'm going to talk about what I think might be going on with Ramana or Srinivasargadatta. Because also you read Srinivasargadatta's like I Am That, one of my favorite contemplative books ever. And he talks very, and usually actually I have a quote of that in my presentation on cessation to illustrate this. He talks about going beyond consciousness, beyond awareness. He very clearly talks about this. And of course, Ramana's example is that he embodied this absence of consciousness. He had like bugs eating away at his body, and his nails were growing crazy. He wasn't eating; he had to have food kind of placed in his mouth. But they come from a tradition where there's this understanding of this epistemology, right? And maybe it's pragmatic as well. Maybe they sort of maybe in their experience they're not grasping at all at consciousness, and they know where they're taking their students, but they're taking them through this route of come first to pure awareness and then just stay there, and then all of the rest will unfold. You'll let go of that and so on. So my hunch is that, of course, these people are very, very deep, and maybe they have a slightly different epistemology than the Buddhists, which are much more focused on, okay, no, no, we need to see clearly that awareness is empty as well. But my hunch is that their actual state is not one of grasping at awareness. It's one of complete sort of release of even that concept. And you do see this when you read carefully the work of Sri Nisargadatta and the way they express themselves, even though the epistemology or the pragmatic tools of the kind of didactic techniques of meditation are different.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just saw someone put their hand up. We'll come to questions a bit later. You can certainly put your questions for now in the chat, and we'll come to those a little bit later in the session. Um, my very potentially amateur understanding of the non-dual teachings is not necessarily that one wants to always be in the same meditative state of one or kind or another, um, but that those states can bring about the insight that, as it were, we're always in that state because awareness is inherently non-dual, um, and a sense of subject-object is, as it were, an imposition or an addition within awareness, which is always non-dual, and so there's no need to be striving after a particular state, except insofar as grasping, clinging, subject, object will potentially give rise to suffering. So if that's your goal, to have less suffering, then yes, you're going to probably want to gravitate more to repeating that recognition. Um, but that you're recognizing something that's always and already true. Does that match your understanding of that teaching or that pointer?
Yes, and that is what one recognizes, right? But then you just have to keep going. That's all. I mean, because all of these things are just sort of certain things. I mean, but okay, so let's say you do recognize this sort of holistic, continuous, sort of pure nature of awareness that is beyond subject-object duality. And oh, wow, it has this big impact when you recognize that. And for a time, it can seem like, no, this has to be the deepest realization. Now, all I have to do is just keep having that realization, whatever. And then some years down the track, that doesn't even cross your mind anymore to even look there,
Mm,
because it's so obvious
mm,
that it's second nature. I mean,
mm,
there's no need to even think about that as being that's significant. So it all just depends on how the thing is unfolding,
mm,
um, and even at all phases of the meditation journey, it's a powerful recognition to check in and see again. That what one now sees about the nature of awareness, if that's part of your practice. But ultimately, I think I think that the tricky thing about meditation is that it's pragmatic, and the traditions are very pragmatic, and so you can take a kind of teaching at a certain stage of practice, and then create a philosophy around it, and then create a kind of destination or so on. Whereas it's better to see all of these things as important didactic techniques at certain points in the path. And then when one part of the path is kind of comes to fruition, and the seeing this ultimate nature of awareness is the thing is excellent. Okay, cool. Now look into the nature of awareness and see, is that too empty? Who's experiencing this awareness? Who's seeing this awareness as fundamental? Is it really? Does it have the three characteristics? And so on. And then there's the new didactics that come and so on. And always experience then evolves. And I don't see any end to this. This is just an exploration.
mhm.
And it's a ever evolving one.
Yeah. Is this kind of back and forth okay for you? It's what
Sure, yeah, yeah.
yeah, because it comes up so much in my circles, this debate, I guess, between emptiness and idealism, and I do always wonder to what extent there's really different claims here, or they're pointing towards the same thing using different language, or this third possibility that you've made quite clear, which is that probably are saying different things, but they're saying different things based on the level or what the student is ready to hear. So that's obviously another interesting um, perspective that I hadn't considered as much before. So thanks for that. But I want to do my best. I'm uh, relatively agnostic and also very open to the what seems pretty reasonable to me, which as humans, or certainly with my own perception and intelligence, I might not have the capacity, and maybe no one does, to have a full understanding of the ultimate nature of reality. But it is a curiosity for me. So I was very warmed at the start of the talk when you said, "Oh, I'm not so interested in Buddhism and I'm not so interested in science. I'm interested in reality." That's kind of the end goal, which I think is quite distinct from, let's say, the goal of reducing suffering, which, again, I'm not a Buddhist scholar. I'm not even a Buddhist, um, although I've been inspired by a lot of what I've heard from those worlds. There is very much um, a goal within Buddhism of reducing or eliminating suffering, if I've understood it. So, as you say, the practices are pragmatic, they're not necessarily aimed at discovering what reality is. That might be a consequence. Um, Same thing, if, at least from the talks I've seen with Swami Sarvapriyananda, the goal is a reduction in suffering, and here's a path that will lead to it. So, there's a pragmatism there. But leading aside, if we were to leave aside the goal of reducing suffering, um, and even make an assumption, maybe that's impossible. Maybe there's no end state which eliminates suffering for all time. I don't know. I'd like to think it's true, possible, but I don't know. Um, and so just looking at what is possible to deduce or ascertain or experience that might lead to one conclusion or another. Um, or maybe I'll just pause for comment before I dive into another question because I gave quite a large frame there. How does that land so far?
What I'm gathering is that you're kind of pointing to this distinction between pursuing the nature of reality versus pursuing the end of suffering
Hmm.
as the very clear goal of the Eightfold Noble Path and the Four Truths and so on. Um, and to some extent, okay, yes, but maybe I would suggest that this inquiry that, for example, the Buddha taught into the nature of reality through, for example, seeing the three characteristics and the actual tools he gave are tools for understanding phenomenologically the nature of one's experience. They actually lead to a reduction in suffering because like you could take the emptiness view, like if you take that view to all of your experience, the system lets go because if you see that something is empty, you're not so attached to it. You're not so concerned about it. You're not so concerned of change. Impermanence becomes something that's just the nature of things, as opposed to something that you need to constantly resist and fight against. And that includes, our existential concerns about death and so on. And so, if you see the emptiness of all of these phenomena, including the self, then this can lead to a profound reduction in suffering, I think, by reducing the clinging. Um, and it's not so complete though. Like as is often taught in the Tibetan tradition, that wisdom and compassion are like two wings of a bird that which cannot fly without both wings. And so there's some the kind of wisdom, the insight needs to lead to love.
Mm,
Really,
mm,
I do think somehow my faith, and I have to take this on faith, is that once you see the nature of reality, the interdependence is so clear and the release is so immense, and love is a natural response to that, and so is compassion. So I think these things do naturally flow out of it, but it may not necessarily be true. And I think cultivating also the compassion side is super important. And so, but both of these help you understand the nature of reality. It's very hard to um, reality when there's so much suffering that you can't sort of clear the mind, for instance. So you need to have certain tools to reduce suffering to understand the nature of reality, and you need reality in order to reduce suffering. So again, I would say there's like quite a powerful interdependence also between these two pathways. Yeah.
yeah. I'm just noticing my internet connection sometimes not being so strong, so apologies for that. Am I coming through okay in this moment?
Yes, sounds good. Yeah.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is even if one's goal is not the reduction of suffering, it would make sense to at least reduce enough suffering, the suffering that gets in the way of a clear view. Um, And yeah, that makes sense to me. So distorted thinking is more likely to occur if there's suffering, which again seems to be correlated with clinging. Uh, uh, I'm curious if there are any neural correlates of clinging that you found or that could even theoretically be found, and if you've seen or would seek to see a correlation between the reduction in the neural correlates of clinging and the occurrence of non-dual states, pure conscious states, cessation.
I think we're very unlikely to see, at least in the short term, neural correlates of clinging because
Would
clinging
you
is
say
more.
neural correlates of clinging are the same as like having a prior? Like they're kind of almost two ways of saying the same thing? Like having a
This is
prior
where
and
I'm kind of,
clinging.
yes, yes. So could be tied to priors. I mean, we don't know exactly what is. We are working on this actually, but like, what is the actual kind of computational mechanism of clinging? And so it's because it gets more of like a habit, right? And it's a habit that you can find in all different parts of your conscious experience. And every person has like some part of their phenomenology that they're more clingy to. Some people are very attached to their personality or their story. Some people are very attached to their body. Some people are very attached to consciousness, or so on, right? So we all each have our things that we're working with and clinging to. Um, and so it's also that already makes it hard to have any kind of unifying neural correlate of it because it's so unique to each person. Moreover, because it's such like a broad computational process and we don't yet know what the thing is, and it's not really a state, right? Because mainly if you're getting neural correlates, it's tied to a particular state of consciousness or some sort of state of being or some sort of stimulus evoked response or so on. Whereas clinging would apply to all of those. So it doesn't matter what state of consciousness you're in. There may be clinging or there may be not clinging, right? So then you're thinking, okay, you're in a deeper state of meditation. You're in a state where you're just blabbing along like I am. In each of those times, you would hope, ideally, if the meditation is working, that there's the clinging is not present, the sort of friction in one's experience. Um, and so how do you capture that? It's very hard because it's like a trait change that's very subtle and changes over time and applies to deeper and deeper parts of our being. So identifying somewhere in the brain that that's happening is very unlikely. But what I think we can do is kind of figure out what is the computational mechanisms of clinging. And then we might find some long-term trait effects. Like for example, flexibility or something like that. So how the brain responds to change could be one way to get at this, for instance. So if a system is trained not to cling, then when a shift in the stimulus happens or a kind of big state change happens, like I don't know, in virtual reality or something, you take a meditator and a novice and you have them shift from realities or fearful realities or whatever to completely new kind of contexts, and you see how quickly their brain adapts, and how long the kind of window of responsiveness that there is in the physiology could begin to give you some sense of what's going on. Because the idea is then that the meditator, or the less graspy mind has this sort of spontaneous flexibility to just kind of return and be here now in whatever happens in each moment. Although they fully feel the full weight of the shift in the reality, there's also this like very fast adaptation, I would expect
So
from
it's
that.
almost a measure of increased neuroplasticity.
Yeah, it could be at the neural level. It could be kind of because plasticity uh, happens in various ways. Like you could have neuronal network plasticity. You could have plasticity at even more basic levels in the microtubules or something. So it's hard to know exactly what kind of yeah, but yes, sort of like flexible or plasticity in a cognitive sense maybe is even more specific. Just noticed my charger got kicked out. I'm just gonna put that back in. There we go. Okay, all good.
There was a podcast with I think Andrew Huberman I saw where he was talking about learning and um, how it used to be thought that adults were no longer neuroplastic, but now we've discovered they are. But watch out because you're not necessarily neuroplastic all the time. You might have to induce that state in order to learn something new, which is quite easy for children. I think it's kind of automatic up until the age of 25, 26. This is what he was saying. And one of the experiments they used was how if you put on glasses that shift the whole world a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right, children up until a certain age, I think there's like a bunch of neurons that map the world kinesthetically, and there's a bunch of neurons that kind of sit on top that map them visually. I could be getting all this incorrect, so feel free to, if you're aware of this stuff, to correct me in a second. But my understanding from what he said was, yeah, if you put on these glasses, then children quite quickly will. So in other words, if I was to reach out my hand and pick up where I think the glass is, it'll be not where I'm seeing it is. And then over the course of hours or days or weeks, the brain figures out, oh, actually, I can start to recorrelate where things are. And that will happen quicker with children. Adults can still do it, but it's easier if it's done in incremental changes and it will tend to take a little bit longer. But things like inducing some kind of frustration or motivation levels will change it. For example, if they don't get to eat unless they succeed in the task, then suddenly it induces a lot of neuroplasticity. So this is my very long way of asking, would you expect that kind of plasticity to increase when there's no longer clinging of like, well, I expect the world to be over here, and like, oh, wait, it kind of seems to be a little bit more to the left. Is that something you'd anticipate or consider to be worth studying?
Hmm. I think that's a very cool experiment to try. Um, I don't know how confident I am. I think it would depend a lot on the person. I thought what my prediction would be is that the contemplative, if they know that this is the task, they will be able to get their mind into such a state that they can do this very quickly. I would probably bet on that. Um, it also makes me think that, the experiment like this could be very interesting in the context of psychedelics too, right? Like there's a lot this sort of theory that psychedelics open up this window of plasticity. Um, and if you do a task like that, would they more quickly recalibrate to this new kind of psychophysical reality in front of them? And I think if you're a good meditator, you know what kind of state puts you in a very plastic state, in a state where you're very open to new information and you're very focused and very um, amenable to new information, let's say, and you can enter those kinds of states in preparation for something like that. Because I don't want to give the impression that a meditator's mind is somehow like their world model is less sort of um, stable. In fact, in some sense, it becomes more stable because it has these meta principles that kind of ground it all. And they're stable meta principles because unlike the world model that most people run around with, that you might argue is kind of less stable or worked out. The idea is that meditation allows you to penetrate your experience so deeply that, okay, at least the models I have are like they're kind of solid. You know that they're just models, so they're not permanent, but they're also quite stable. And then you can know how to work with your own models to kind of make them flexible and so on. Long-winded way of saying I think it's a very cool experiment, and I would predict if you told a good meditator that that was their the goal here, I think they could pull it off fast. Yeah.
A little bit quicker. Okay, super interesting. All right, just to circle back around to this whole non-dual thing again one last time. Um, the As I'm sure you know, and most people listening, the idealist conclusion, in other words, the notion that consciousness is primary to existence, has been arrived by some people philosophically um, through contemplating the hard problem of consciousness. And so if I was to posit that there's an existence out there that isn't conscious and it's whatever, a bunch of Lego bricks, atoms, molecules, whatever, um, and that somehow give rise to consciousness seemingly magically when there's enough complexity or interaction or some kind of mere epiphenomenal um, occurrence, doesn't seem coherent given that they're two completely different categories and that one is imagined, as it were, because obviously we're never going to experience something that isn't within or part of consciousness. I'm assuming the cessation experience doesn't change your view on that. Um, does that, how do you think about that? And as in a right, and again, I think one can arrive at this conclusion lightly and not hold on to it as kind of a clinging or attachment. I'm now attached to consciousness, but just from the perspective of, given the constraints of my reasoning and intelligence, it seems to be the most parsimonious view, which is I don't see how unconscious matter could give rise to consciousness, but I can explain reality in terms um, of consciousness.
I think there's something very attractive about building your kind of model in this way, like starting with kind of consciousness first. Um, and so I can see, and for many years, I would say I held that position in some sense. Um, and it is clean. It's somehow clean, right? To kind of mirror what you're saying, to basically recognize that all concepts, matter, things, all analyses, all experiments, even the Large Hadron Colliders, whatever, it's all happened within conscious experience. No one's ever encountered a single data point in science outside of consciousness. And to think that you can kind of step outside of consciousness to do anything is a kind of immense delusion, you could say, right? Like it all starts with consciousness. The only thing you can possibly know for a fact is that I am conscious. So we'll start there, and build your model from there. And I think that's fine. That's fine. I think it's just not something that I find that I really need to do good science. It's not something that I find very important. I think it's interesting sometimes to understand things in their qualities as things, and sometimes it's interesting to look at consciousness as the nature of them. And I think it's also just useful to see, for example, that well, that whole story that I just told that is so strong is itself kind of just another story of something that we can't actually um, categorize. I mean, because again, like I would ask the question, and it feels okay, like maybe you're kind of suggesting that, well, just play the game. Like you have to have some philosophical position, right? And I think, okay, true, but think about that even more philosophically. So consciousness is this thing that's basic and it's experience, and but then I ask you, okay, but what is that, right? What is this thing called consciousness that you experience? And if you say there's nothing other than consciousness, then why do you make how can you say consciousness is a thing?
Hmm. Yeah.
What is that, right? So
Yeah.
you've made a thing of something, and then you build a whole model out of the thing. But I'm just saying, like, it's not as clean a philosophical model as one would think, because you've started from a certain axiom.
Hmm.
It's kind all axioms have limitations, and we know this sort of in mathematics, no, even in mathematics, right? So you can always deconstruct axioms. I prefer to have a bit of flexibility in axioms, because you could say I'm somewhat pragmatic in this sense. What
Hmm.
helps us is more important. Yeah.
Yeah. Just to frame my approach, which doesn't speak necessarily for anyone else, which is so I'm certainly not saying, oh, we have to have a philosophical view, and like this is this is the one. Um, my view, although I think do people have to have it? I suspect people subconsciously have a philosophical or metaphysical view that they might not ever think about, but they probably have one which is um, mediating their experience at some level. You'd probably know a lot more about that than me. That would be a prior, I guess. But whether or not that's true, the perspective I'm trying to take playfully is like, well, I'm curious about it. A phrase I've started to use recently. I probably have a story or several stories. So I'm noticing my internet connection is unstable again. Can you still hear me?
I can
Yeah.
hear you now. It did cut out a little bit there. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. Just let me know if I have to repeat something. So out of the metaphysical stories on the table, this seems to be the least worst. And I agree, it's still going to be a story, right? And it's going to have elements to it that are undefinable. Like, how do I define consciousness? Well, yeah, give if I'm going to posit that everything is made of or is an excitation of consciousness, it's the one thing that can't be defined because it is the ground. So almost by definition, by making it the ground, it's undefinable. Um, So yeah, if that's kind of a good enough context to ask the next question, which is, all right, I'm not kind of putting my stake in the ground and saying this is definitely the truth, but like, okay, well, if you're going to ask me, um, uh, there's a bunch of questions where this is my best guess. I'm not saying it with 100% certainty, but I've got good reasons to think of it this way. Um, from that perspective, what I struggle to understand is how cessation, and I've not experienced cessation, although I've obviously fallen asleep and can't remember what happened, and I've had an anesthetic, and so I've had periods of my life where other people tell me, "Hey, you weren't conscious then." Um, what would be special about cessation that would prick a hole in that story as, to use the words, as the least worst metaphysical position we could take given what's available to us?
Before I go into cessation, I guess I'll just say one thing about that is it's like an interesting test, and we obviously can't run this experiment, unfortunately, but it's like which worldviews give you the best practical outcomes in some sense. Like, would would we as a society have built the Large Hadron Collider if we started from consciousness axioms? There's a small chance we might not have because we didn't imagine that matter could exist and that you could, take, it's like, okay, like everything is consciousness, everything is matter, not material and so on. But yet the materialistic worldview achieved a lot. I just want to sort of put a pin on that as just a small comment, and it's not a very strong argument, honestly, but it's just an interesting thought experiment. The cessation thing is interesting because it's it's so it so pulls the rug out. Uh, and I guess suppose I'm talking more about cessation in the context of like the big transformation that happens, the kind of stream entry sort of tangential events. And this is where the cessation is also that there's the insight, there's the real clear seeing, and indeed actually when you're entering into something like a cessation, it often begins with the deconstruction of consciousness. It's like right in the final stages, you actually see the what's left is consciousness, and you deconstruct the consciousness, which is something mad to do because you think it's you're in the state that was already so incredibly pure and beautiful, and then you're like, but can I dare to even look into that and look into that's nature? And then if a cessation happens, you see that, okay, well, that was nothing. That wasn't a thing. And so when you see that this thing, this idea of consciousness is just another idea, right? This is so paradoxical for people because you talk about experience, you're like, no, no, but that really is a thing. The experience, and that's why we have the whole hard problem of consciousness and so on. But if you go right into that consciousness and you like really deeply inquire into it, you find that, oh, it was more concepts in some sense. And it
What
is
what do
dependent
you
and
mean
it's
by
conditioned.
just to make sure yeah, this brings me to that question around metaconsciousness. Like, what do you mean when you're saying consciousness? Let's make sure we're using the term in similar ways.
What am I meaning when I say consciousness?
Yeah, when you say,
Uh,
oh, if you really look at consciousness and you see that it's not a thing, what what is it you're
Uh, I mean, I suppose I would go indeed in the kind of Chalmers direction. It's like the qualia, the experience itself, right? The fact that there is something that it's like to see red or to feel what it's like to be inside of a body and so on. And of course, for me, I take that even a step further because I'm very familiar with the kind of Thomas Metzinger's MPE, the whole pure awareness thing. The pure quality, the idea of like pure experience itself without any contents, right? All of these, I think, are characterizations of consciousness that are valuable and helpful for making sense of things.
Mm.
But I think the conclusions that they lead to are premature. And if you take because they kind of fall out of introspection, right? The the kind of hard problem of consciousness falls out of this introspection of okay, what is it like to experience something? Oh wow, that what is it like quality is always kind of there, and it's very hard to get at, and you can't. It's hard, right? And then you go, okay, wow, in all meditative states, in all states ever, awareness is there. There's no state that ever happens. Nothing is ever done. No science is done. Nothing is that. No relationship is had. No phenomena occurs without this awareness being present. introspective thing is I'm like, okay, great. Go look into that consciousness even further. What is its nature? What is the nature of that consciousness? What are your beliefs about that consciousness? So that's what I'm suggesting is kind of leads to some sort of shift that's hard to articulate, but it's more about like the attitude one has about this whole concept of consciousness. It allows you to let go of even the idea of consciousness. And then where do you find yourself? Well,
Mm.
you find yourself here, but you find yourself here without having concepts of here, without having the need to say that this is consciousness. What is this before your idea of consciousness? I think that's very interesting
Mm.
question to ask.
Yeah. As a kind of, again, pragmatic, like pointer as inducing something brilliant. I'm getting a sense of what you're saying. Obviously, I am speaking as someone who's not experienced cessation and hasn't taken meditation to the levels that you have. And of course, I'm aware that um, I've had lots of experiences in life where there were no words that I could have put to that experience that would have made it tangible to someone who hadn't had that experience. So, apologies if this gets frustrating and we go around in circles, but
No, it's
um,
good. Can I say something as well, just very quickly? I
yeah.
just wanted to, I like, I always, I usually make this caveat at the beginning, so it's important to make it now. Like, I don't think cessation is this thing that everybody you need to experience. Like, I think there's people much more advanced than me in meditation who will say perhaps that they've never experienced cessation and it's meaningless and it's pointless, whatever, right? Okay,
Mm,
so that's fine. It's
mhm,
just that. And in many cases, actually, people don't know that a cessation has even happened, right? They just know that something immense happened and something immense changed in their consciousness. And then they just focus on the change, right? They just don't pay attention to the fact that there was this sort of split second of non-existence. And what even is non-existence? It's not that you're aware of your non-existence, so it doesn't make sense. It's just a cut. It's just a thing. So I don't want to make like a big deal of cessation. I don't want anyone to think that they need to start to try to get to cessation and that that's the only way to really understand the nature of reality. I don't think any of that thing is true. Any of that is true. It's been something very important in my sort of particular path, but it's also something that I hold very lightly. And we need to also see the emptiness of this whole story about cessation, right? So I just wanted to make this caveat. Yeah.
yeah, no, perfect. Thanks for doing that. And I'm just obviously self-conscious because if we were um, debating and hopefully it doesn't feel too much like a debate, but I want to represent this side of the view as strongly as possible so that I hear the best. And I think this is a curiosity other people who sign up for these talks share to hear as the best articulation possible that counters that. Um, yeah, and I'm just self-conscious that if we were talking about what insights could emerge from whatever eating chocolate, and I've never eaten chocolate, then I'd be like, "Oh, okay, well, maybe I should be eating chocolate if I really want to get to grips with what this might mean to someone's life, or falling in love, or grief of losing a close family member, and I could have all sorts of ideas what that might be like, but I'm sure anyone who's had that experience would tell me, look, the experience of losing a parent or losing a child is not something that we're going to be able to describe in words. And you can have as many great philosophies about it as you like, but they're going to come wanting. So again, that's my caveat or disclaimer from the perspective that I'm taking. Um, but I'll just ask this question in one more way, and then we'll go to questions in the chat and from anyone here with the remaining time. Um, Are you able to say anything about, um, so given that, as you so beautifully said, everything is arising in experience, in awareness, nothing we'll ever experience is outside of that. Um, and obviously, I hear this, I'm not a physicist either, but I hear there's like the measurement problem or something in quantum physics where the act of taking the measurement potentially changes what's being measured. Well, that's obvious just in day-to-day life. Most people, when they even start meditating, they're vaguely aware, oh, as I put my attention on the breath, the instruction is not to change the breath, but it seems to change as soon as I put my attention on it. So the fact that I'm putting my attention on a thing can change the thing or change the perception, at least, of the thing. Could the instruction of, okay, I'm now in a pure, and this is my long way of asking for your response, as it were, to the editorial that Essentia Foundation put on your talk on YouTube, which is saying that, oh, we think that what Ruben's talking about is metaconsciousness. In other words, what we can report about consciousness, because by its very nature, phenomenal consciousness without metaconsciousness, without the ability to report on it, can't be reported on by definition. And it restricts your investigation and your study. And certainly when you talk about, okay, I'm now left with pure consciousness, let me start to look at it, you're creating a dualism in that moment of like, oh, there's something looking at the consciousness, and it's no longer subsiding into a state where there's no subject object, there's no analysis. Does the question make sense? And so feel free to riff on that, and also your response if you have one too, because I think what I'm hearing is that you don't necessarily agree with how they've framed your article and discussion. You are talking about phenomenal consciousness, if I've understood you.
Yeah, yeah, I'm talking about phenomenal consciousness. And okay, if we start to postulate the existence of some mystical, like underlying reality, that one wants to impinge the term consciousness on, um, then okay, maybe something like that exists. I'm epistemically open to the possibility of mystical realities, right? Um, I'm not sure that those mystical realities are so concerned with our concepts of consciousness per se, or phenomenal consciousness, whatever. But the phenomenal consciousness that we talk about in philosophy and science and so on, and even as meditators most of the time, I am talking about that, and I am saying that what most people think is not this sort of dependent arising with more duality there than we expect. I am saying that there is more of that, and that if you um, I think like people find their concepts of awareness and even their brief encounters with something more clean in awareness so persuasive that they're not willing to imagine that their experience or their concept about it is conditioned. It's just so persuasive. And, I have a long history of studying stuff like this. Insight moments, for example, are so persuasive. They come to us with this feeling of truth. Well, then I take that into a lab and I can show that that feeling of truth that we take as our like source of understanding reality, we can manipulate that. We can make you have false insights on demand, right? And I think people are having insights about the nature of awareness that makes them so convinced about their ideas of awareness that they just can't pull themselves out of that, or they're not willing to deconstruct them and look at them closely. And again, I have a very middle way position because I do think there's something, as I've said in the talk, that something irreducibly profound about awareness, and the fact that it's kind of this quality, this phenomenal quality, is sort of present in whenever we are awake. But what I'm saying is that that phenomenal quality is is also a construction, is also something that is sort of bound together through this interdependence of reality, and that if the right conditions are created, then you can see that that is something that's a constructed phenomenon, and you can see because the consciousness reconstructs, and you can watch it reconstruct. You can watch the consciousness put itself together, or the consciousness watches itself be put together. It's completely mysterious, but it
Mm.
does reveal to you very clearly that this thing that people are thinking is this sort of fundamental ground of everything is a misunderstanding from an introspective perspective, and it's also a misunderstanding from a scientific perspective. So for me, these things converge to tell me that something that interdependence is much more true than imagining that consciousness is some sort of fundamental reality. I think everything, including consciousness, arises in dependence on everything else. And I think interdependence is a more beautiful thing as well, because it puts us fully embedded in this reality, as opposed to creating some sort of duality between consciousness and not consciousness. Which comes as very subtle, because people will say that everything is consciousness, but they're still arguing with people. And so there is something that they're saying that it's not, but it's
Can
very
you can
subtle.
you explain that one?
It's hard to explain. It's very hard to explain. But there is a subtle duality there because you are imagining that there is this thing that's consciousness that's separate from this other worldview, for example. And what you end up with is just two worldviews pinned to get together against each other, right? Okay, you can take the kind of idealism versus the materialistic, whatever. What do you have? You have two people with two worldviews in their mind that are clashing together. That's
Mm,
one mind, and they're just two worldviews clashing together. It's
mm,
dualistic. It's completely dualistic in practice and in reality. Um,
mm.
yeah,
Great. I'm just oh, there's more that I'd love to say on that, and perhaps we'll do that another time. But I'm aware there's people very patiently waiting.
yeah. And I
Um,
know I've probably upset a lot of a lot of people with my view on these things, but it's subtle, it's hard to articulate, and it's often it is this sense that I get and it's happened in many conversations where there's a kind of desire to kind of pin it down or something like that. And I'm sort of kind of pointing to the fact that this pinning it down is the very issue that is the duality that is actually um, behind which is the kind of interdependence that is more satisfying and more coherent as a worldview. Yeah.
mhm. Great. Um, okay, so let's just with the remaining minutes see what questions are arising. Is it okay? Now, if you're happy being on camera, uh, then I'll spotlight you. If not, then put your question in the chat and I'll read it. But Martin, I saw your hand up. So just put your hand up again if you're happy for me um, to unmute you. Okay.
Hi, Ruben.
Hi,
It's a
Martin.
pleasure to meet you. I contacted you twice on email. Never mind.
I
I
thought I
know that
recognized your
I
name, but
I know that you're so busy, and it's just a pleasure to be on a call with you. And I love Amir for putting that together. So my background is in philosophy, but I kind of grokked that you're not into really answering the deep philosophical questions here. And I know that Amir already drilled into this quite a lot in this conversation. So I'm basically not going down deep this route. Um, so from all the papers that I've read, from many to none and the beautiful loop and all the things, I was trying to understand how this whole framework of with Carl Friston and this predictive processing and Jacob Howie and all these guys, how how a meditation technique could actually lead to these prediction errors that then could potentially lead to this kind of cessation event. And from all of these papers, I kind of got the feeling that there is some kind of a progression from focused attention to open monitoring to some kind of a dual meditation. And I'm yet to talk to Delson about it, but he charges like $300 for a session. But I would like to understand what kind of non-dual practice would you think from your own perspective or experience could lead to something that is akin to, a cessation event, if at all? I mean, does that make sense?
yeah, I think so. Um, and first of all, thank you so much for reading my work, and it's always an honor to meet someone who's read the many things and has insightful questions about it. So thank you. Um, yeah, what kind of non-dual? So if I understand, what kind of non-dual practice might lead to something like the transformation associated with a cessation, let's say?
Hmm. Yeah.
I would say a non-dual practice that is really firmly committed to taking the inquiry into the nature of reality all the way and doesn't stop. Basically, one that just keeps going and going and going and going and going and going and going until there's nowhere left to go, until the question eats itself,
Hmm.
until consciousness eats itself, folds in on itself. And you don't stop, and there's no it, and there's no end. You just keep going. If the non-dual practice is that that honest, has that much integrity, is that authentic, then it'll take you there. It becomes much less about method. It's not about method. We of course we talk about method when we're doing science and we're trying to teach meditation and so on, but much more important is authenticity, potentially in some phases. And this is we have to be careful with this, but at a certain time, intensity as well. Honesty, humility, integrity, and total disillusionment is necessary. So it's much more about these kinds of conditions than it is about any kind of particular practice. And these conditions are very hard to create. These conditions have to come through life. Meditation makes those conditions more likely to arise, I think. But you can't become disillusioned with all the fancy spiritual states and all the
Mm.
kind of ego dramas and all the kind of mysticism and all the kind of figuring out the nature of reality. You have to become just disillusioned with all of it to be able to let it all go. And it's not something you can't let go either. So it's all something through the authenticity of the practice is the only thing that works. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it's kind of a technique, where you would sink into this core subjectivity, and then you just stay there, and then you stay there and stay there until even that kind of subjectivity that you take as the groundless ground basically evaporates into nothingness, right? And I mean, you've quoted Sri Nisargadatta, right? I mean, even if you take all of these I Am That books or Beyond Consciousness and all these different recordings of his teachings, there is a similarity between what you are talking about from a scientific point of view and what he's describing from apparently a very kind of pragmatic point of view, right? So it's a wonderful kind of alignment there.
And
I could
and
probably
to be
go.
fair, yeah, I will just say, just to be fair, that I'm very inspired by Nisargadatta, even though it's been a long time since I was like in his work. I used to have I Am That like on
Mhm.
hand everywhere. So
Under
I
the
kind of
pillow.
it's sort of in my bones, this his teaching. And I can't remember the word he used to say, but he makes the same point that it's more about the sort of, I can't remember the words, but something
Sincerity?
sincerity, exactly. Something like sincerity. There's still another word, but he points at this idea of sincerity, authenticity, integrity as like the most important feature of the practice. And of course, the non-dual way is, and going straight to the subject is a kind of shortcut potentially for some people. But
Mm,
it's a shortcut that can possibly also leave a lot unexamined. Because you do need to examine the dual as well. Because in the end, we end up also living in a dualistic world, and we need to somehow have the kind of non-duality of awareness and the duality of life become something contained, something that we can hold as this sort of paradox that doesn't cause us friction. And that way we can be free to live our life in whatever state the mind find itself in.
mm. Thank you. I could probably go on, but that would be quite unfair. One last thing, you've mentioned you're coming to Europe fairly soon. Are there any conferences that you plan to attend or anything like there's a Barcelona, I think, a consciousness summit in June or July. Are you planning of attending any kind of those conferences where we could meet in person, or where all the other, folks who are researching in this regard, like like Chris Latherby or Jacob Howie and all these folks, where these would meet? Because I'd like to have a meeting like that where all of these pioneers in leading this kind of meditation research are coming together. So I was just curious if there is anything that you are attending and that would be publicly available.
I think I'll probably go to ASSC, the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness. It's in Crete in Greece,
Hmm.
uh, sometime in June or July. I can't remember when, but I'm aiming to go to that. It's actually at exactly the same time, unfortunately, as the Science of Consciousness conference in Barcelona. I'd love
Mm,
to go to both,
okay.
but probably I'll end up at ASSC. Yeah,
Okay.
hope to see you there.
Perhaps. Thank you, Ruben. It was lovely.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Martin. Thanks for coming. And yeah, I know you have more questions, as do I. I've really enjoyed this chat. So I don't know, Ruben, if There'll be scope for another more like Q&A at some point in the future. Let's see how you feel later, perhaps when you're in Europe. If you ever
Sure.
come past London, we could maybe do a combined event with Shamil as well and discuss your paper. That would be a lot of fun. Um, yeah, we've got time. If it's okay to take one more question from Ines, Ruben. Yeah,
Sounds
Ines,
good.
you can unmute and
Hi, Amir. Hi, Ruben. Thank you very
hi.
much for organizing this talk, Amir, and thank you, Ruben, for the excellent presentation. So I'd like quickly to get back to the basic and check with you my definitions of two terms, which is cessation and shunyata, emptiness. So cessation, when we talk about cessation, it's the cessation of the narrative self, cessation of the mind, cessation of the self that conceptualizes and that builds phenomena. However, the knowing element is always there. So there is no disruption of the knowing element, but the mind, the thought process, the narrative, even the sensation, all that dissolves. Is my understanding correct? And also, when you say going beyond awareness, what does it really mean? Which kind of awareness we go beyond? Is it the dualistic awareness, object subject, and we go beyond it to non-dualistic awareness where there is only pure consciousness? So this is the first definition to clarify.
Um, again, the varieties of cessation is something I might kind of come back to. In fact, there's a chapter that I wrote in the Varieties of Nothingness book, along with Vismay Agrawal, that you might want to check out, where we specifically do a lot of work in distinguishing between the idea of emptiness and cessation. So if you're interested in like very fine-grained and detailed analysis of these, I would kind of point you to that. I think cessation, when I say the varieties of cessation, you can have this kind of cessation where everything is gone, but what's left is this minimal phenomenal pure awareness. That is like the knowing quality that you described. Yeah. But I won't place any kind of rigidity or permanence to that knowingness either. And so what I've been kind of pointing at is that even that knowingness, even that awareness itself, can come and go, is impermanent, anicca, is not self, anatta, and grasping at that knowingness causes suffering. So in that sense, I would say the emptiness goes a further, because the emptiness also penetrates that knowingness, and the emptiness eats its own tail. And then there's something much nicer, which you might call freedom.
Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong, but when we, in Dzogchen, for example, when we talk about the ground, so this ground has this knowing element, which is, I mean, in Buddhism, we talk about impermanence, but this ground or this knowing is the only thing which is permanent. And it's a very simple knowing. So correct me if I'm wrong, but like I'm not getting the idea, or like what you are suggesting, that even this knowing can be interrupted.
Yeah,
Ground
that's what
can
I'm
be
saying.
both empty and knowing. Like
I,
I'm wrong. So if
yeah, I am saying that this knowing can be interrupted.
okay.
Yeah, and then I realize that sometimes conflicts with some traditional accounts, but I also have a lot of people I interact with from the Tibetan tradition in various forms, and I think that's why it's called the groundless ground. That ground doesn't end up having any kind of actual quality to it, and it actually is the phenomena in and of themselves. But there is no special thing.
Okay.
Yeah, in my view.
And the last thing, what is your definition of emptiness?
Um, my one way to express emptiness, which again is more of a insight or understanding than it is a definition that is easy to put in a textbook or something like this, is the sense that at this there is no essence. There is no essence to anything. So if you look deep enough to anything, you find that it is not a thing, to put it that way. And if the emptiness inside goes all the way, what you find is the dependence, the interdependence of all things. So you can examine anything, whether it's the mind, thoughts, sensations, perceptions, philosophies, awareness, consciousness, perception, any of these things you can examine. If you examine them deeply enough, you find that the thing is not a thing. And when you find that the thing is not a thing, and you find that deeply enough across your experience, you will find that therefore everything is dependent on everything else, and what's revealed is much more of a profound interdependence, as opposed to the existence of permanent forms.
Thank you. Thank you, Ruben. Thank you, Amir.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ines. Yeah, thanks everyone that joined. Thanks, Ruben, for 2 hours of your time expounding on all your research. Thanks also for doing the research and also being a researcher that is a practitioner. I think that's still relatively unique, isn't it? And but so valuable. And I'm excited about the papers you've written. I'm excited about the ones that are yet to come, and hopefully the people that you are inspiring to do similar work. It feels really important for so many areas of life that are outside just the kind of narrow insight meditation tradition. I think it will inform lots of other areas of life. So yeah, just deep gratitude. Looking forward to having you in Europe. Any last things you want to say before
No,
we
I
say
think this was really fun, very juicy, very deep, and I'm super grateful for the invitation. I very much look forward to catching up in Europe sometime and speaking in person. So, and thanks everybody for your questions and for tuning in.
Great. Cool. Thank you, everyone. Until next time.
Adios.
Thanks, Ruben. Have a good night.
Bye bye.
Everyone in Europe, have a good day. Cool.
Ciao.
Ciao, ciao.